This podcast is brought to you by Workle, a platform helping people get happier at work. Find out more at workle.co. Work happier.
I've worked with gravediggers, nuclear weapon makers, architects, nurses, lawyers, filmmakers. I mean, you name it, I've kind of worked pretty much across the kind of gamut of different forms of work. Everybody was very nice to me, but nobody wanted me there. You know, I was this kind of person who, like, what is she doing? Why is the world like this? You know, and again, in a quite naive way, we put a man on the moon, but we've got this incredible poverty and inequality. Why?
On this edition of the Happy WorkLife Podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Hilary Cottam, a public service innovator and author who has just published a new book, The Work We Need. She's also currently conducting a review with DEFRA on working life in England's upland communities. Her career spans working at UNICEF, the World Bank, and setting up 2 social enterprises. I'm keen to hear her reflect on her working life, the future of work, and what inspired her to write her new book. So, Hilary, I'm really keen to explore with you your new book, The Work We Need, and all of the wonderful recommendations you have in there for people to have happier working lives. And I know that that's based now on hundreds of interviews we've had with people all over the place. But before we get to all of that, just a little about you and your work journey. So when you were young at school and at university, what was it there that appealed to you most? Were you very academic? Did you have any thoughts then about the kind of work that you would go on to do?
Well, Mark, thank you. It's really lovely to be here with you. Yes, I think it's always really hard to know kind of what lit that seed. I've got a very early memory from childhood that I wrote about in my first book, Radical Help. And I grew up in Madrid, and all the houses in this sort of small cul-de-sac where I grew up shared a gardener. I mean, he was somebody that swept up the leaves, and he didn't come for a bit. And my father said to me, we need to go and find out if he's okay. And so we drove in a really hot summer's day across Madrid and kind of crossed the train tracks. And we went to his house. And when we got there, he lived really in like nothing more than a shack. It was a shack. And he had sort of 6 or 7 children, and they all had their things very neatly on hooks around the wall. And I don't know, I was sort of a primary school child. And I literally couldn't believe the difference between this lovely man's home and my own home. I mean, we were like, you know, kind of middle class, like my dad was an accountant. There was nothing wealthy about our home, but, you know, I had a kind of middle class upbringing, and it was just enormously stark. And I think from that moment on, really, I was kind of mission driven. I, in a very naive way, wanted to make the world a better place. And I just had to somehow then find work that could help me do that. And the first half of my career, I worked internationally, and I think that was partly about where British politics were at the time. There wasn't much interest in kind of social Britain in the late 80s. And so I went to other parts of the world and had a kind of very rich learning experience through that work.
And those early experiences, Hilary, did they form your thinking on what you wanted to study at school and at university?
I'm not sure. I studied history, which I think is a really good formation for anything. I didn't know how I would get there. You know, I didn't know there was no career path for people, you know, who want, there's nothing at the sort of university milk round for people who want to change the world, you know. So I kind of had to figure it out. And then when I graduated with an arts degree, I just wrote hundreds of thousands of letters to people really saying, can I have I was of course completely useless. Can I have a cup of coffee? Can you help me? But I had won a student journalism prize. I'd started a magazine, and in the end, I found a very small advert in The Guardian for what was really the humanitarian wing of a guerrilla army in northern Ethiopia. It was, you know, supported by the European Community and USAID, and they needed somebody that could go there and help them write project proposals. And so that was my kind of first step on the ladder. It was an amazing step on the ladder because I ended up in this Ethiopian community organization. And everybody was very nice to me, but nobody wanted me there. I was this kind of person who, like, what is she doing? Oh, yes, I guess we need her because she can write these proposals in English. But usually when you work in international development, you're the person, as later happened to me, that arrives, from the World Bank or whatever on a plane, and you immediately get shuffled in to meet a minister. But I started completely the other way around, right at the bottom in a community organisation, living in a collective house where nobody wanted me. And I think that was just an absolutely brilliant work learning experience.
And just going back again, you told a story about when you were young and going to see the gardener and being struck by the differences. Was there anything else in those years at university or school or with your parents that gave you this drive to want to change the world and make the world better? Was it that single experience, or was there a culmination of things?
I don't know. I mean, I was really curious. And so from then on, I kind of, what I really wanted to understand was, why is the world like this? And again, in a quite naive way, we put a man on the moon, but we've got this incredible poverty and inequality. Why? What on earth can we do to sort this out? And I suppose, so I think the work I did and the studying I did was all about that. I mean, later I did a master's degree and then a PhD, and that definitely was about a kind of inquiry to try and understand why social institutions like governments and the World Bank that are set up to actually supposedly help people don't help, often cause more trouble than they're trying to sort out. So definitely there's been a kind of continued sort of path where I've done some work, gone back to study and reflect, done more work to think about how we can shape those systems.
And then talk to us about your time at UNICEF and the World Bank. What was that like?
Yes. So I mean, I was really with the World Bank, and I got seconded to UNICEF in Zambia at the time. And so I joined the World Bank at a time where it had been under kind of immense critique for not actually making any change. And there was a movement to start to do work with people in communities and try and kind of shape policy at the World Bank through kind of what we would today call lived experience. Nobody used that term at the time. And I worked in the infrastructure department for Southern Africa. So I had sort of 7 countries, and I was responsible for urban poverty, basically, which is kind of obviously ridiculous. And but it was very, very formative. I worked under some brilliant people who were kind of open to kind of thinking differently. I set up teams in the country to kind of produce ethnographic research, really, that was kind of citizen led, which again was kind of, not really done at the time. And we used that research to drive really different investment policies at the World Bank. So an example would be that I worked on a very big water credit to restructure and rehabilitate water infrastructure in Zambia. And all of this citizen research, this citizen ethnography showed us that 80% of Zambians were not on the water supply. So I was able to argue that if you spend this gazillion, billion, whatever dollar credit rehabilitating the water supply, 80% of Zambians still aren't going to have any water. And we were able to completely restructure and think about how we brought water to different kind of informal communities, how we made that safe because it's always women who collect the water, and so on. So that was a kind of rich experience, really. I learned a lot.
And what are your reflections now when you look back on the World Bank and on that time? How might it have been different to the thoughts you had about what those institutions do and how they behave, and the reality of what you found?
Well, I think I kind of had a very rich learning experience. I found it, I mean, I really became convinced. I mean, I worked sort of, if you like, I worked with a guerrilla army. I then worked, I mean, obviously in a humanitarian role. I then worked with a very large NGO, and then I ended up at the World Bank. And I really, and then actually I went back to study a master's in international development because I thought that really none of those institutions had the wherewithal in order to kind of solve the kind of really systemic problems we've had, and that I needed to think completely differently about unlearn and relearn. And that was the beginning of the work I do now, which is deeply rooted in communities, starting really kind of, as in the workbook, what do people who work tell us? How can we think differently from that perspective? And then the other thing I thought was just, actually, I just need to work in my own country. I just don't personally feel comfortable with this role of kind of, turning up in somebody else's country and giving advice. I need to kind of I'm British. I need to root myself in Britain and grapple with the canvas that I've been given here, really.
So tell us then about the social enterprises you set up.
Yes, well, I didn't want to set up social enterprises. I wanted to work for local government. And so I came back, I did a PhD, and that was really a guise to begin to kind of connect to people in Britain and see if I could find any work. And I found this was in the late 90s, and I found that this wouldn't be the case today at all, but it was then, was that absolutely nobody could sort of have an idea of the work that I'd been doing, in Africa and in the Caribbean, and think about how those skills might sort of translate to Lambeth or Leeds or wherever else. And so I just couldn't get into local government at all. And I realised that my path was completely closed, and that the only way I could get started was to kind of create something myself, really. The other thing, so I realised two things, I suppose. One was that nobody was going to let me in. They couldn't see that I had got any relevant skills. And the other was that actually sort of participatory democracy, kind of, sort of working in communities, was far advanced in the countries that I'd been in compared to what was happening here. And the Labour government had been in power for a couple of years, and they were proposing to rehabilitate British secondary schools. And I thought, well, this is a mirror image of what I've seen in Zambia. We're almost in the 21st century, and we're going to spend all this money kind of doing up 1950s schools when our society's changed, what we need to learn has changed so dramatically. Of course, work had already changed. We need to think completely differently about that. So I got a very small pot of money, and I sent a pamphlet, I didn't design it, was beautifully designed pamphlet to every secondary school in Britain saying, we've changed our workplaces, we've changed our lives. Why are we going to just, rehabilitate schools? Why aren't we going to think differently? And who would like to work with me to think differently? And various people came forward. And then, to cut a very long story short, Estelle Morris, who was the Secretary of State for Education at the time, gave me £14 million. Inconceivable in today's world, isn't it? To basically run a participatory process with the community that lived around a school that at that point was labelled as failing, with the teachers and pupils in the school, and with officials in her department, to think about how could we think about the curriculum and buildings in a different way. And we built a school which is still one of Britain's most successful transformed schools. And we did kind of about 44 more schools, I think, in that particular social enterprise called School Works. And I suppose that so I'm proud of that work, but also in a way, I'd got the bit between my teeth then. I realised that, you could sort of be a minnow and run very fast and actually get stuff done. And that's what I wanted to do.
So that takes us then pretty neatly onto your latest book. So if you could just talk to us about why you decided to write The Work We Need, but also all the things you did to underlie it. And I'm then keen in a practical sense to talk to you about DEFRA and the work you've been doing with DEFRA. But let's go back to the genesis of the book. What made you want to write the book and think about work, and whether work in the way that we've thought about it to date is fit for the future?
Yes. Well, to answer that, I need to go back again in a way, because my second social enterprise was called Participle, that I ran for 10 years. And that was a book about how we should reform the welfare state. And it argued really that our social systems haven't been reformed since they were set up after the Second World War, that we've sort of had lots of arguments about how to make them more efficient, but we haven't really thought about what kind of support do we need in this century to kind of live well. And I did a 10-year project looking cradle to grave, like Beveridge did, designing new support for families, for older people, for work, for learning, and so on, how to get into work for unemployed people when I say work. And I wrote a book called Radical Help about that experience. But as I wrote the book, which was sort of, you're with all your background, Mark, you know about this, you know that you're always rolling the rock uphill. And when you're actually kind of in a business, whether it's a private business or a social business, you don't really have much time to reflect. And when I wrote the first book and had time to reflect, I sort of thought I'd been working on the wrong side of the coin, that I've been focusing on social systems, but I need to focus on work. Because what's happened in the sort of last few decades is that the sort of big shift, if you like, since the welfare state was designed, is that when Beveridge designed the welfare state, he had this premise that everybody had good work and families could support themselves, they could live well, they could thrive, they could think about, positive and sort of secure futures. And then sometimes things would go wrong. You might have a work accident, you need a health service, you might get ill, you might fall out of work, you need unemployment support. And of course, you needed really good education to be kind of trained for work. But he didn't imagine that there would be this lacuna at the heart of our systems, which is not good work. And because mainly I work in communities that we call left behind places, I really don't like that phrase. And I talk about why it's a misnomer in the book, The Work We Need. I thought, I've got to understand work. And the first thing I did was I went to people who represent those areas and I said, what are we going to do about work and local economies? And people literally put their head in their hands and would go, Hilary, don't ask me about that. We've got no idea anymore what to do about it. And so I just thought, well, that's not an acceptable answer. And because of the way that I always work, I thought what I need to do really is I need to just go and sit in places and I need to talk to people who work and see how they think we should redesign good work in this century and how we should redesign local economies. So I worked in 5 places in Britain and then the work was picked up in the United States and I followed up with 3 further US places. And I'm sure that we can think of some people that I haven't worked with, but I've worked with gravediggers, nuclear weapon makers, architects, nurses, lawyers, filmmakers. I mean, you name it. I've kind of worked, I think, pretty much across the kind of gamut of different forms of work, gig workers and so on. And I think what's really important as well is I've always worked with people in small groups because I think people are much braver to talk when they're kind of in a group rather than a sort of one-to-one interview where people might tell you things that they think you want to hear. So I designed some very simple tools, stuffed them in my rucksack and went off and asked, people in groups of 8 to spend 3 hours with me. First of all, thinking about what does a good working life actually look like in this century? And in the second half, thinking, how would we get there? And of course, most people had never worked like this. And I'd have a tea break in the middle and I'd always be terrified that everybody would just leave me in the tea break. Who is this mad woman? We're not doing this. But in fact, people wanted to stay. I mean, there's a hunger for these conversations and there's no sort of outlets for it really, apart from, I think, in the very best businesses. And so, it was people wanted to join in.
And so what did you learn?
Ah,
What did the gravediggers want? What did the nuclear scientists want? What commonality was there? How did you get to your thesis at the end, which underlies your book about those things that do make good work?
well, the first thing I should say is that I'm a sleeves rolled up, active action person. I'm not a writer, and I, obviously Radical Help was a kind of very successful book, but I never intended to write another book. But I was driven to write the book because I heard the same themes come up again and again and again. And I thought these are things that we're sort of talking about, but aren't really there. They might be there kind of at the margins of our discussion, but we need to bring them center stage and we need to look at them in a different way. So a really good example is the book opens with Johnny, who's a gravedigger in Kilmarnock in East Ayrshire. And the thing he wanted to talk about was time. And he began to kind of draw this extraordinary sort of map on the table, and gradually all his peers joined in. And he wasn't talking about a kind of a 32-hour week, which would be, a good thing, or a kind of, shorter working day or whatever. He was talking about how we can allocate time through a working life, partly because he's also does very physical work and he knows that a promise of a retirement at 65 or whatever, he may not be kind of well enough to actually use that retirement. But he had really interesting ideas of what he called a non-linear life, how you would reorganize time. And then, a pandemic, and 2 years later, I was in the boardroom of a kind of blue chip company that I won't name. And the team got to their feet with their marker pens and they were like, what do we want? We want time. We never want to make partner here. We'll never be able to kind of control our lives. And so what I saw were these themes. There are 5 kind of core themes that everybody agreed make up a good working life. And they're about, being secure of the basics, having work with meaning, having the space to care for one another and actually nature. Time, as I've talked about. They're about play, which really surprised me. I mean, if you'd asked me what are going to be the 5 things before I set out, I never would have thought about that. And they're about rethinking the role of place in our work. And, I sort of, what I do is I set these off and I put a recorder on the table and then, the conversations and the kind of arguing and the banter starts. And then afterwards I listen to the recordings. And I suppose these were like sort of melodies that sang out again and again over the sort of all the hubbub. And I thought it was so interesting that we have this sort of huge agreement in the nation of what it looks like, and that what people want would we know that the best workplaces, this is what would drive productivity in Britain. Actually, it's so interesting, and yet we're not hearing about how to do that. And I thought I've got to write about it.
So let's go through those one by one. So starting off with the basics. So let's walk through your 5 and see how much they resonate with people listening to the podcast.
Yes, and indeed with you, that would be. But
Oh,
yes.
they definitely resonate with me.
So the first one being the basics. That we have to live in a country where people earn enough to stand on their feet, and that they're secure of those earnings. That they know day to day, that they can plan. I started off with gig workers in London, and that they don't earn enough. They never know when they'll work. They do have time off, but they can't use that time off because they don't know when they'll next be called to work. And so that's just something that we have to do something about. Obviously, we've got a plan at the moment. I mean, Paul Novak of the TUC is saying today he hopes that those plans will still go through, that the government's designed. But it isn't actually just about law. It's also about whether those laws that we already have are held in place, and they too often are not. The next one is about meaning, which I think is really
So
interesting.
before meaning, just on
Yes,
basics.
yes.
So obviously pay, which you mentioned earning enough, but did people talk about things like safety at work?
Yeah.
Or I know you go on to talk about well-being, but were there any other things that were wrapped into a basic requirement for people at work other than pay?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, pay, a secure contract. You know when you will work, like which hours you will work. And I have to say, I think that's really interesting because we're meeting on a day that the tube strikers, and what we see, and I write about this in the book, is that when the media cover strikes, I mean, this also, of course, they all overlap. This relates to time. They always talk about wages, but the tube drivers themselves are not talking about wages. They're talking about the fact that they have got these schedules that now make it impossible for them to know when they'll work, so they can't do a shift of their own childcare and so on. And I think this is like a real, so kind of that security, not only of income but of kind of time. Freedom from surveillance was a huge subject that has obviously grown with kind of AI. It's one of the biggest areas of AI investment, is kind of surveilling your workers, and people don't like to feel surveilled, and you don't get the best out of them if they're surveilled. And then safety was very big. So I worked with construction workers in the US. I worked with, again, gig workers who are asked to kind of carry too much on their bikes, but if they don't take it, their app will be closed. So safety is very big. And we have, I can't remember the statistic, but we have there's a sort of legal norm internationally of how many inspectors you're meant to have. And we have, a fraction of the inspectors we're meant to have. So I think it is really important to say in Britain that we have laws, but unfortunately the laws are routinely flouted, whether it's that people don't get pay slips, so can't prove that they're not paid enough, or, that the surveillance is meant to be for one thing, but it's actually used for another. We have huge problems with kind of enforcing the laws that we already have.
So all of those things chime perfectly with the work we do at work, or the Happy at Work test, the Work Happiness Charter. So being paid fairly, that your hours obviously meet your needs, but also you feel safe in your working environment. So yeah, I completely agree with you about the basics. Go on to your next step.
So I think what's really important about the basics is that people didn't really want to talk about the basics. It's so boring. I mean, what people say is like, don't waste our imagination with this in a way. It's like, this is my human right to have these things, but there are more interesting things to talk about. And the first of those is meaning, that people want work with meaning. And I think that work with meaning is a very interesting category because it means, I mean, in the book, it's sort of, people talk about it in three different levels. So one is that you have to think that the work that you do actually has purpose. So you're not just sort of some widget, whether it's kind of literally, drilling in a bit, or kind of, filling out some slide deck for some presentation that you think is completely purposeless. So the work itself has to have some kind of meaning in the confines of your workplace or your company or whatever. It also has to have meaning at a much bigger level, if you like, on a kind of world stage. And one of the people that I talk about in this chapter is Laura, who's a welder at the BAE nuclear weapons system in Barrow. And so, I mean, we might all have, I've certainly got my own opinions, but about, all of this. But what's important is that she is highly skilled. She knows that her work really matters on a day-to-day basis, but she also knows that she's part of a national project of defence, and that she's got a kind of role in the British community as a whole because of the work that she's doing. And then the other thing that Laura's also part of is that this idea that of making comes out very, very strongly, that there's a sort of deep human thing that we want to be makers. And so this can be obviously kind of making a garment or making a submarine in the case of Laura, but it can also be making in a kind of more abstract way, sort of, we are making presentations or we're making ideas, but we have to feel that in that making, that our brain and our heart and our hands are in some way in sync with each other. And again, goes back to sort of what's the purpose of this work. But it's really clear that that's, absolutely, sort of, I mean, I say that all of these elements have to be on a par. You can't kind of offer people meaning but no basics. You can't offer people, care but no basics. But actually, whether the work has meaning is really absolutely core. And that's about buying into the bigger purpose. It isn't a sort of, that this, because I think also what's really important is some of the most unhappy workers I met work for, let's say green companies or kind of NGOs where there's a dissonance between the sort of apparent public purpose of the work and actually what the work feels like in that company. So everything's got to be kind of lined up.
And do you think
It's not about values on the wall, basically, is what I'm saying.
and do you think that all work is good and all work has some purpose? And do you think it's the manager's responsibility to help people understand the good that they're doing in their work? Or do you think that's more for an individual to understand?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, I mean, I do, the sort of David Graeber bullshit jobs. I mean, and he asks, like why so much work has been spun out in capitalism that isn't good. And so I think that the sort of two things about that good work. So one thing is that much of the work that is most important is undervalued and therefore not seen as good work, whether you're sort of cleaning the toilet or you're kind of caring for another human being. And this is something I grapple with in the book because there's no, work doesn't intrinsically have a status. We decide politically and as a society what work to give status, and we've seen work change in status over the centuries and often in technology revolutions, which is really interesting. So I think one of the things is that how we value work that may not feel good but is humanly really, really important. And then the other thing I think would be how do we automate work that isn't actually kind of humanly rewarding? And I think it's really interesting that the automation discussion is all at the creative end rather than at the end it should be, which is like, let's take out some of these things that aren't creative and also retrain people. So I mean, one of the examples in the book is, IKEA, who've taken out quite a lot of their call center people for very routine calls. We'll see how that works if you're actually the IKEA customer. But anyway, this is what they've done. And they've retrained all those people who didn't like being in the call center as sort of entry-level interior designers. So they've got much more creative work. It's also helping kind of with the productivity at IKEA in terms of kind of sales as well as people's happiness. So I think those things are very interesting. But you've asked a big complex question. I mean, of course, there's also a sort of intrinsic, would I be happy making a nuclear weapon? Probably not. I also could, I mean, the dexterity of Laura, like, I could never do it. I'm just lost in admiration. But I think the work's got to, as you mentioned, I'm doing work at DEFRA. I'm working kind of with farmers and with environmentalism. And, that kind of ticks my boxes. I'm kind of really happy, sort of, some people might say, aren't you, you've just spent all of January or whatever walking over moors in the freezing cold, but it doesn't matter because I'm kind of like, so there's always a personal element. And then the final element is what is the role you asked me of the boss, if you like. And again, that's a nuanced thing that there is, of course, the role of the company, of the boss in motivating people. And, I tell the story of, famously like asking, have you got dead wood in your company? Were they dead wood when they arrived? But it is also about the worker has responsibility as well, I think. And, this goes into also how there's a big theme of second chances in the book. It's very difficult in Britain in particular to move between work. For all sorts of reasons we might come on to. And obviously being able to move between work would be really, so you can find, for most of us, it's a journey to find what kind of, hole we fit into. We talked about that with me. I started off in international development. I'm much happier now, but that was a long process of being able to switch between things.
Okay, so we've got purpose as number 2. Number 3.
Yes. Number 3 is care and repair. So I think that in the modern world, it would be really important to think of every worker as a carer and to think that most of us, most of the time, are holding those dual roles for friends, for little people in our lives, for older parents, and that we've got immense burnout from people not being able to juggle the sort of the kind of work of sort of human reproduction, if you want to put it that way, and the kind of work of production, and that we need to kind of make those boundaries very different. And again, there's lots of case studies where companies have done that and get huge loyalty and productivity from their workers. But at the same time, and we know in Britain that we've got 5 million people who are not working because they simply have given up. They just can no longer bear trying to kind of care for somebody in their family as well as do the work. And often those are quite small things. Like most of the time they could, and if they just were allowed to have their mobile phone on them for that moment of emergency, they could keep working. But because they can't risk it, they can't work. So these are not huge policy matters. They're kind of human matters about thinking in a more dynamic way about, care and work. Because most of us, and again, this is a big kind of argument in the book, we're not just working to earn, we're working to grow as human beings. And part of that growing as humans is taking care of each other. The thing that also came out that there was so much I hadn't expected, but people put care for their place and the environment on a par with care for people. That especially sort of in the post-industrial places in Britain that I worked in, they're on the edge of enormous sort of nature reserves and beautiful, beautiful places, and people want to care for those places, which is also really interesting, I think, and time to do that.
And then number 4.
What's number 4? Number 4 is time. We've talked about time. So time is so interesting. One group of people came up with this idea of universal basic time. They're not interested in universal basic income, but they are interested in universal basic time. And I think that's interesting because, along the way, I've spoken to, we might talk about it, but I've interviewed a lot of business leaders, and I've also interviewed people who are union leaders. And one sort of famous union scholar in the United States said to me, in the end, you can push business to negotiate on wages, but you can never push them to negotiate on time. And yet what people really want, we've seen it again and again and again, is time back. And we've also seen that where businesses are brave enough to allow workers to kind of work according to different time patterns, sickness goes down, loyalty goes up, productivity goes up. And I start this story with Kellogg's. In the 1930s recession, Kellogg invented the 6-hour week the 6-hour day, sorry, that he would have shifts for 6 hours, and workers would earn the same as they used to work for 8 hours. And the purpose was that he'd been persuaded by Roosevelt that to kind of share the work in the Great Recession, that in the communities people should have work for dignity. But of course, what he didn't expect was the kind of enormous kind of growth of productivity, growth to his bottom line. And people from all over the United States went to look because they also thought technology would shorten the working day for everybody, and this was the future, and could they learn how it's been done? And instead, of course, we've forgotten it, and now we've just had the kind of shorter working day experiments in the UK and the US all over again. And it seems to be some sort of cycle that we can't quite believe that we're not better workers if we're not like machine cogs, but if we actually have time. And so we have to keep forgetting it and relearning it, which I think is fascinating.
And then everybody, I'm sure, will be surprised to hear that number 5 is play.
It's incredible. Were you
Yeah.
surprised to hear that number 5 was play?
Yeah, I in some ways I was, but it's the way you describe it in terms of needing time to play and what play is. So
Yeah.
for the listeners, talk about play and why the people you talked to thought play was so important in a work context.
Well, I think what I should say is for the first half, when I meet with people in these sessions that I call imaginings, I've got these 72 tiny playing cards that people in small groups look at together. And the point was just sort of stimulus for the imagination. There's just a little drawing, and there's a play card, and it's got a game on it, I think. And what happened every single time was that people would shuffle through these cards and they would all agree that play, and they'd stick this card down with determination on the table and they'd talk about it. And then there are also cards for technology devices. So that was the flip side, is people would have these and they'd kind of have their finger on them. They sort of move them around the table and then they debate it, and like, we don't like devices, we don't want our phones, but no phone, no work, what should we do about this? But this dedication to play, which did not mean that everybody was playing, but this idea that the sort of good human life, the good working life, is a life that where you have space for this other dimension, which isn't simply resting on a Sunday or a Thursday or whatever in order to kind of go and be a better cog in the machine the next day. It's about being able to live in a different creative dimension and have space to do whatever it is you love to do, whether it's playing football or reading a book or bird watching or playing board games. That this is a sort of fundamental aspect of human nature that we have to nurture. Um, there is an argument that it makes us better workers, and it clearly does make us better learners and better workers. But you've got to be very, very careful, because the minute you're asked to play with a kind of strategic purpose in mind, it no longer feels as like play. So, if your company takes you off a fun away day, you might appreciate it and you might have a nice time, but that isn't actual play that you choose with your friends or even alone for something that kind of feeds your soul in a completely different dimension.
And Speed and Lewis, who established the John Lewis Partnership, had a really interesting take on this. He was very keen that obviously everybody was an owner of the business in the way that it worked. And one of the things he said is, if you own a business, if you're successful in a business, then you can indulge your hobbies. And so he paid for people to join clubs, and he would give 100% subsidies. So there was a pottery club in John Lewis, there's an acting club. He bought 5 ocean-going yachts so people who wanted to sail could go and sail. He built 2 golf courses so people could go and play golf. And it was all about, how do people indulge those things that are around the world of play and subsidized and provided by the world of work, which was incredibly insightful when he did that nearly 100 years ago now. And so when I joined the John Lewis Partnership as a graduate trainee in 1982, it's a very long time ago, there was a society for everything: archery, golf, art, and all of the clubs would meet, and you would be paid for your vocational hobbies as well as non-vocational. So they would teach you to learn things that were relevant to your job, but also anything that would grow you as an individual was encouraged. And I thought at the time it was incredibly insightful. And it was why, when you pulled it out in your book, it really resonated with me. And it was, for him, it was about developing the individual outside of work, but also about the collective, bringing people together who work together to enjoy things and do things. And he felt that improved the working spirit, working relationships, built connectivity. So it had a bigger purpose than just being around play.
It's so interesting. I didn't know that about John Lewis. I find that fascinating because, of course, Kellogg's also had this idea of, the ping pong club and the jam making club and everything. But also, I think, so interesting, it relates to, the sort of the next principle, which is place. Because one of the bigger arguments I make in the book is we've sort of got social connectivity the wrong way round. What we've said is, if we can grow our economy, we can invest in, spaces for communities to play and kind of community halls and all the rest of it. But productivity comes first. And I think what comes really clearly out of the book is that if we invest in our social connections, we create work, actually. I mean, we create businesses through serendipitous connections, we create actual work, and we need to kind of turn that on its head. And it's the same, actually, for the way we think about health in this country. The government is kind of obsessed with funding the health service, but of course, people are sick, they're not working because they're sick. They're sick because they're working in bad work. We've got to fix work rather than kind of, well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't fix the health service, obviously. I wouldn't sort of go down that route. But, these are 2 critical things about work, the sort of, the health side and the social connection side, that we've got sort of upside down, topsy-turvy at the moment. So I find that really interesting. But they don't do it now. Does John Lewis do that now?
Yeah, no, they still do. Whether it's at the same level, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but they still do. And when you talk about work and healthy work and good work, to what extent is that driven by the manager, and to what extent is it just the work itself?
Well, I think that really, it's both. It's definitely both. And I think if the role of the manager depends a bit on what sort of organization it is. If you work in a very, I'm working with government at the moment, if you work in a very hierarchical organization, who sets the culture at the top is absolutely defining, and it doesn't matter how motivated and how brilliant you are. If you're lower down the chain and that chain is not set right from the top, you can't be motivated. But I think there are other work which is kind of more fluid and more creative, where individuals have more space to kind of do things differently.
So can you be happy working as a gravedigger?
Oh yes, definitely.
Can you be happy working as a cashier in a supermarket?
Well, so you see, I think this is really difficult. So everything is qualified. So one of the things I say about the gravediggers is that I met in East Ayrshire, they were a part of this brilliant experiment whereby work changes as you get older. So you can be a gravedigger when you're younger because it's very physical, and then you can drive the lorries, and then you can kind of be somebody that takes care of kind of estates, like a kind of, janitor type role. And so that's revolutionary, because those used to be three completely different roles. But now thinking about how people gain life skills and perhaps lose some physical energy, those have been made a pathway. And then that transforms how you think of your grave digging, because that's a phase in a kind of very different chain. And so I think, the thing about being on a supermarket checkout, obviously it depends where you are and whether you're in a community where people have a nice chat with you, doesn't it? Again, it kind of goes back to social connection. I think I've got lots of stories in the book where people have taken those roles. I've got stories where, Laura the welder, for example, was on a checkout and thought, oh my goodness, I've got to get out of this. I've got to get to college. I've got to, I've got to learn. In fact, she started training as a vet. She's very bright, didn't suit her, went to work on a checkout, didn't suit her, and found her way as a kind of highly skilled welder at BAE. But I've got other people in the book who have taken those roles because, back to the care question, because I want a job, I want to get out of the home, I want to have human interaction, but I must have something that is highly boundaried, because really I've got a daughter at home with disabilities, or I've got a brother that needs whatever. And so I think this is a very, very difficult question. I'm not judging that is not good work, but what I am judging is that very often people have taken those roles because we haven't been able to structure the kind of higher productivity work which they're very talented and good for in a way that they can do.
And so let's move on then, lastly, to the work you're doing with the government now with DEFRA.
Well, we haven't talked about place. Can I just talk about?
Oh, of course, of course.
Because I just think that place is the one that sort of and actually kind of relates to the work with DEFRA, but place also came up as a principle because work happens in a place. And I think the role of kind of place in how work is shaped is really critical, and has been overlooked for a couple of decades, because we've got this idea of sort of work being kind of, amorphous in where it's rooted. But one of the things, because I don't think we'll have time to talk about this, but there's a whole strand of the book about business leaders and kind of, especially in a kind of technology revolution. And one of the things that I found is that business leaders who have a relationship to the place where they have their businesses have very, very different ideas about kind of what matters and how to work with their workforce and how to get productivity and get good business going, which of course historically has always been the case, but is still the case today, which I think is really interesting.
And so talk to me about place then and your DEFRA work, because as you say, it's sort of related in terms of the upland and upland communities.
Well, so the DEFRA work is sort of brings everything back together, really. I was invited by Steve Reed, who until Friday was the Secretary of State for DEFRA, for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs. He asked me whether I would do a government review of Britain's upland areas. And upland areas, we've got 6 big upland areas, and they're just simply defined by being above the moorland line. And they're extremely tense places. I mean, they're very beautiful places. I'm sure everybody's been to one for their holidays, but they are places where all our environmental richnesses, basically our water, our peat, and so on. And they're also places of marginal farming. And what's happened over sort of recent history is that the environmentalists and the farmers have become quite sort of locked in a kind of, well, battle is probably too strong, but not always. And so I had actually worked with Steve Reed in local government, and he said, I think what we need to do is take a social systems approach and see if we can look differently at these areas rather than trying to trade one off against the other. And so, which I think is very insightful. And so I said yes, but that I wouldn't run a traditional government review. I would work in the way that I always work, which means that I then spent 3 months walking in 6 upland areas, Like I say, bad timing, January to March, so pretty high up and pretty cold. And so I basically spent my time walking with farmers, with environmentalists. I mean, farmers of all different types, the rewilders, the sheep farmers, the cattle farmers, the tenant farmers, the kind of grouse moor owning landowners, environmental campaigners. And then in the evenings, I ran workshops in the pub with people who live in places, whether they're the publican or they own the garage or they, are the teacher, whatever. And it was amazing work. It was incredibly interesting. I mean, it's a whole other podcast to talk about what I learned about. I mean, one of the kind of most profound learnings, I think, is I'm from Herefordshire. I mean, parents with a sort of small sheep farm, but work mainly urbanly, and how all our sort of policy brains are so urbanly geared, to thinking so differently about rural communities and what's required. And also, what would happen if, I mean, I suppose, two things. One is what would happen if we invested in giving communities the resource that currently goes, as so often in government, it's not that resource isn't flowing into those places, but it's flowing in tiny silos. You can have this grant for this and this grant for that. What you can't do is all get together and decide how you could use that resource differently, which of course would have a massive multiplier effect. So that sort of, I've got, obviously insights and recommendations from the work, but the biggest one is that we do a kind of large scale experiment and we ask people who are currently at loggerheads if they'd like to come together with a sort of much more mutualized pool of finance and think very differently about how they would use that. And this current story is kind of, having a commercial break whilst we see, hopefully the incoming Secretary of State will also support the work and we can continue. But, it's day one of our new Secretary of State, so I don't know yet.
And do you have any early thoughts on how you do make things better in those areas? Having spent 3 months walking around, what are your early feelings?
Well, I mean, the biggest feeling is that really, which is that, that everybody's sort of scrabbling for resource that is controlled in this very hierarchical, vertical way. And that if you enabled people who lived in that place to kind of actually have control of the resource and make those decisions themselves with much longer time horizons than government allows, but also kind of collectively, you wouldn't have the scrabbling. But we know that that sort of wars break out in all sorts of forms when people feel that there's not enough, and so then we begin to argue about whatever it is, whether it's housing or immigration or kind of grants in the uplands or whatever it is. But actually, if we know there's enough, we think generously and very differently about the creative potential. So I think that's that's kind of one thing that we'll look at, is how do we think about mutualizing what is there in a very different way, and putting people in control of funds that are anyway going to them, but with kind of longer term horizons and in a kind of more collective model. The other thing is that there's just in most of these places, there's not the most minimal infrastructure for any form of business, whether it's a food business or it's an agricultural business. And so really thinking about how we put that infrastructure back is a really important part of what we do. But it's also about kind of thinking, at the moment, everything is it is just very vertical. There's this organization that does this, from government, and this that does that. And actually, if everybody got together in a place and tipped everything on its side and thought horizontally, how do we connect? And again, if we just take the farming example, I mean, I've met such innovative farmers as part of this work, doing really different thinking about their farming, about their land, about environmentalism, of course, because they've got a long-term role in this. They don't look to kind of government or somebody in the hierarchies for ideas. Of course, they look to each other. They look to their peers and they think about, just as in any business, like who's doing this brilliantly? Can I go and walk with them? How can I learn from them? But this is kind of at the moment high risk and against all the sort of incentives. So again, thinking about how we foster, moving sort of from this, nobody can see it on the podcast, but from this very vertical way of thinking about things to a much more horizontal way of thinking about things. But also in the next phase of work, going back to places and really getting people in those places to design things that are designed in place, make sense, they stick and they grow. And that's what it'll be about.
Hilary, thank you so much for sharing with us your thinking on the work we need. I hope people are motivated to read your book and really think about their jobs and their work and what they want it to be, and how through thinking about what you've done, they might achieve that. But also thank you for all the other work you're doing, whether that is with the government or helping people think differently and creatively about the new world. It's been a pleasure talking to you on the podcast. Thank you.
Mark, it's been so nice to have the opportunity to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well done. Great. That was lovely, Hilary. I
Oh,
really
thank you
enjoyed
so
that.
much for having me. It's really, I've heard you on the bottom line. I'm a huge fan of the bottom line. So it's really nice to meet you.
No, well, it's lovely to meet you too. And when I left John Lewis and after my brief time in government, I sort of devoted myself to try to help people have happier working lives and get more from their working lives. And for me, one of the biggest drivers is the manager and the way that managers treat people, and there's so much that controls an individual life about the relationship they have with their manager, who controls their pay, who controls their hours, who controls the information they have, who either treats them with respect and listens to their views and empowers them or doesn't, who really is responsible for their well-being, their sense of purpose, their career development. And John Lewis was just the most wonderful organization in making people think about the happiness, and the supreme purpose of the John Lewis Partnership is the happiness of the people that work there. That's
Yeah.
its goal. And because of that, it had lower staff turnover, lower sickness, higher productivity, better customer service. And so, having worked with that for 30 odd years, I sort of felt incumbent to try and set it out and help people. And we do run this free Happy at Work test that now 1.5 million people have taken around the world, with data on 200,000 organizations.
But I've seen your list and it's so interesting again because, there can be companies like Care, I've seen that people think can't offer good work, but can if they're managed in the right way. It's so interesting.
And it's different for men and women and
Yes.
sexual orientation and disability. So, I mean, trying to help. And the other thing that I don't know if you found it in your research, but the depressing thing is that some people don't expect their work to be happy. They just think it should be miserable and awful, and it's something they have to endure. So, I mean, it was Socrates and Aristotle, as you know, 3,000 years ago, who first started saying, no, the pursuit of happiness is legitimate. You should want
Yeah,
happiness. You
absolutely.
shouldn't feel as though it's all done to you. And so, helping people, as you've brilliantly done in your book, understand what are the things about your working life that are important, how can you change them, and thinking about them. It's such great work, Hilary. Such great
Oh,
work.
it's so generous of you. Thank you so much. I mean, I genuinely don't think you can be happy if you don't like your work. I mean, it's too all-consuming in your head. And, as you said, who it brings you into contact with, like you've got to have good work. But unfortunately, too much work today isn't good work,
And I don't, I'm in a slightly different place in that I think all work is good. I think it's about the way that that work is explained to you. And I suppose it's because I did work in retailing, hospitality for so long that there were brilliant cashiers who loved their jobs because they loved the interaction with people, being
But
part
yeah,
of the team, serving the community. But it's the way the manager explained it to them and talked to them about how good they were at what they did. If you can say to somebody, you know what, you are the most brilliant cashier, you're efficient, you treat people so well, you're thoughtful, you're kind. If you haven't seen somebody for a while, you ask them how they are. And it's that kind of community link. You're doing more than just scanning something through a till. And so for me, it's more about work being noble. You work to support your family, you work to develop yourself, you work for something greater. That's why we go to
yeah,
work, because we're trying to do something that's greater.
exactly.
So I think trying to get people to understand that, and worklessness now is, I mean, the government seem to be, Hillary, trying to find a solution to worklessness that's either we need to increase the minimum wage, or we need to disincentivize benefits in some way, take benefits away, because it's all about pay. Or alternatively, it's doctors are being too lax and they're signing people off that shouldn't be off. And what they're not thinking about is, but it's all about people wanting to go to work. How do you create an environment, as you
I
talk
know.
in your book,
And
where people
everybody
want to
wants to
work?
work. Everybody actually does want, well, I mean, of course, there's not any everybody, but pretty much everybody wants to work. And as long as you can support that, as you say, in the right way, people don't want to be signed off for benefits.
No.
Nobody wants that to happen to them.
So the answer is the one that you're looking at, and the work we do, which is How do you make people want to go to it? What makes work feel great? And all the six things you talk about, these are the things that make work great. This is why people want to go, because they care about their place. It's a place to have play or fun. So you're doing great work.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I might circle back to pick your brains on some things later down the line, but very nice to meet you. Thank you
hugely
so much.
lovely.
Thank you.
So
Okay.
lovely to
Thanks,
see you.
Meg.